Every year, tourists pour into Napa Valley for the vineyards, the tasting rooms, and some of the most beautiful scenery in America. Most of them drive right past a 138-acre compound sitting just off the highway, behind fences and overgrown trees. It is not a winery. It is a psychiatric hospital, one that has been operating since 1875. Over the last century and a half, what happened inside those walls makes it one of the darkest places in California. Forced sterilizations. A serial killer they let walk free. More than 8,000 dead patients buried in unmarked graves. And somehow, it is still open today. To understand how Napa State Hospital became what it is, you have to go back to 1870, when California decided to build the most ambitious asylum the state had ever seen. At the time, the state had only one facility for the mentally ill, the Stockton Asylum. It had been designed for 80 patients. By 1870, it held many times that number. People were sleeping in hallways. Conditions were deteriorating fast. California needed a second hospital, and the governor wanted it to be different. He wanted it to be a model for the entire country. So he sent a doctor named Edmund Wilkins on a national tour, visiting 149 institutions across the United States and Europe to study every approach to treating mental illness that existed. Wilkins came back with a recommendation rooted in what was then a revolutionary idea: moral treatment. The belief was that fresh air, pleasant surroundings, structured work, and human dignity could actually heal a broken mind. The state purchased 192 acres of ranch land in the Napa Valley from a local landowner named Cayetano Juarez, paying just over $11,000. Architects from San Francisco designed a 4-story Gothic Revival building with 7 towers, built from 10 million red bricks, every single one made on the hospital grounds by the workers constructing it. When it was finished, locals called it the Castle. It was the most imposing building in the entire valley. Its towers were visible from the rooftops of downtown Napa, miles away. Napa State Hospital opened on November 15, 1875. Its first patient was a man from San Francisco, admitted for alcoholism. The grounds eventually expanded to over 2,000 acres, stretching all the way from a wharf on the Napa River to what is now Skyline Park. The hospital became entirely self-sufficient, with its own dairy farm, orchards, vegetable gardens, a bakery, and even an underground rail system to move food between the wards. On Friday nights, they held dances inside the castle. Townspeople came, staff came, patients danced alongside them. For a brief moment, it looked like California had built something truly humane. That moment did not last. Within 3 years, the 500-bed hospital was already full. By 1880, it held over 800. By 1891, it held more than 1,300, nearly triple the intended capacity. The attics were converted into dormitories. Hallways became sleeping quarters. By 1900, the local newspaper ran a headline that captured the scale of the crisis: the Army of Insane. Napa held over 1,500 patients, with no sign of slowing down. And the reasons people were being committed would shock anyone today. Alcoholism, yes, but also epilepsy, homelessness, depression after losing a spouse. The official admission records from the 1890s list causes including jealousy, disappointment in love, and masturbation. Women were committed by their husbands for what doctors called acute mania or melancholia, diagnoses so vague they could mean almost anything. Once you were inside, getting out was another matter entirely. If you had been alive in the 1890s, chances are something on that list could have applied to you or someone you knew. Think about what would have landed you in a place like this, and let me know in the comments. It is a question worth sitting with. By the 1920s, cottage buildings designed to hold 26 patients were crammed with 70. The neighborhood surrounding the hospital became known as Imola, named according to local legend after an Italian town that also had an asylum. Residents of Napa still use that name today. It is a place defined by the institution at its center. But overcrowding was not the worst thing happening inside the castle. What the doctors were doing to the patients in the name of treatment would eventually make the hospital infamous for reasons that had nothing to do with how many beds it had. In the early decades, the therapeutic routine mostly meant work. Patients farmed, cleaned, and maintained the enormous grounds. One common task was floor polishing. Patients spent entire days pushing heavy blocks of wood up and down the castle's hardwood corridors until they gleamed. The hospital called it occupational therapy. Whether the patients saw it the same way is another question. But as the population grew and resources shrank, the treatments grew darker. Hydrotherapy became standard practice in the early 1900s. Patients were immersed in water for hours at a time, sometimes in scalding baths, sometimes in ice-cold ones. By the 1910s, doctors at Napa were experimenting with malaria fever therapy, deliberately infecting patients with malaria to induce fevers that were believed to treat syphilis-related psychosis. Electroshock therapy arrived in the 1930s, and then came the lobotomies. Dr. Walter Freeman, the psychiatrist who made the lobotomy famous by performing it with an instrument resembling an ice pick, spent time at Napa State Hospital and donated research materials to its library. Lobotomies were performed at Napa from the 1940s through the early 1960s. The procedure involved inserting a sharp instrument through the eye socket and into the brain, severing neural connections. It was meant to calm violent or agitated patients. Often, it simply destroyed them. In 1947, the San Francisco News published an exposé on conditions inside California's state hospitals. The word they used was deplorable, but the exposé changed little. And the truth is, the treatments were not even the worst of it, because there was something else happening inside Napa's walls, something that went beyond any definition of medicine, something the state would spend decades trying to forget. In 1909, California passed one of the first forced sterilization laws in the United States. It gave medical superintendents at state institutions the legal authority to sterilize any patient they chose, without consent. Over the next 7 decades, approximately 20,000 people were sterilized across California's state hospitals. That is 1/3 of every forced sterilization ever performed in the entire country. Napa State Hospital was one of the facilities where these operations took place. Working-class patients, young people, and people of color were disproportionately targeted. Research has shown that Latina women were significantly overrepresented in the sterilization records. Some patients were told, directly or indirectly, that agreeing to be sterilized was the price of their release. The choice was not really a choice at all. For decades, the records of this program were thought to be lost. Then, in 2007, a historian named Alexandra Minna-Stern found 19 reels of microfilm sitting in a neglected filing cabinet at the California Department of Mental Health. Those reels contained nearly 20,000 sterilization recommendation forms, complete with names, ages, diagnoses, and family histories. The evidence had been there the entire time. No one had looked. California did not repeal its sterilization law until 1979. In 2021, the state launched a reparations program offering $25,000 to surviving victims. Researchers estimated that roughly 831 of them were still alive, with an average age of nearly 88. For most, the acknowledgement came far too late. But the sterilization program was not the only catastrophic failure at Napa. There is one story that captures, more than any other, just how broken the system truly was. His name was Earle Nelson. Born in San Francisco in 1897, orphaned before he turned 2, both parents dead from syphilis. He was raised by a deeply religious grandmother. At age 10, he was struck by a streetcar while riding his bicycle, and he was unconscious for 6 days. After that, nothing about him was ever quite right. Nelson was first committed to Napa State Hospital in 1918, after erratic behavior during a stint in the Navy. The psychologist who evaluated him wrote that Nelson did not appear violent, homicidal, or destructive. But another doctor noted something more troubling. Nelson spoke of hallucinations, of hearing voices that whispered to him to kill himself. Over the next several years, Nelson escaped from Napa at least 3 times. The staff gave him a nickname, Houdini. After his third escape, they simply stopped looking for him and discharged him from the records, noting that he had improved. In 1921, after attempting to assault a 12-year-old girl, Nelson was recommitted. Doctors diagnosed him as a constitutional psychopath with outbreaks of psychosis. He was placed in restraints. Over the following 18 months, he appeared to stabilize on anti-syphilis medication. Then he grew restless again. He escaped once more and showed up at his aunt's house. She later described his appearance in terms that are difficult to forget. His eyes were black and glaring, and he looked, in her words, awfully insane. On March 10, 1925, Napa State Hospital discharged Earle Nelson for the final time. His file contained 3 words, discharged as improved. Within a year, Nelson began killing. He would knock on the doors of boarding houses, pretending to be looking for a room to rent. When the landlady showed him inside, he strangled her. Then he assaulted her body. He killed at least 22 women across the United States and Canada, hiding their bodies under beds and moving from city to city under false names. His youngest victim was a 14-year-old girl in Winnipeg. The press called him the Gorilla Man, the Dark Strangler. He was finally captured in Canada in 1927 and hanged the following January. Napa had assessed him as not dangerous. They had let him escape repeatedly. They had discharged him as improved, and he became the most prolific serial killer 20th century America had seen up to that point. The system did not just fail, it created the conditions for a massacre. And then there is the question of what happened to the patients who never left at all. One former attendant who worked in the castle in its final years remembered his first day on Ward 12, the so-called violent ward. He expected chaos when he walked in. Instead, he found most of the patients sitting quietly in chairs, staring at nothing. Not violent, not raging, just gone. Whatever the system had done to them, it had not cured them. It had emptied them out. Most of those patients would never leave the hospital grounds. On the eastern edge of the campus, there is a field. It does not look like much, a stretch of grass, an old outbuilding, an abandoned calf barn. But beneath that ground lie the remains of 4,363 patients, buried between 1875 and 1924 in graves that were once marked with small wooden stakes. Over the decades, those stakes rotted away. Some were pulled out to make it easier to mow the lawn. Eventually, there were no markers at all. When the burial space ran out in the mid-1920s, the hospital built its own crematorium. It operated for nearly 4 decades, burning the remains of patients whose families never came to claim them. In 1968, approximately 5,100 sets of cremated remains were transferred to a mass grave at a memorial park less than a mile from the hospital. A monument was not added until the 1990s. Another 440 sets of ashes were buried with numbered markers in a paupers section at a nearby cemetery in St. Helena. In total, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 people died at Napa State Hospital. Across all of California's state institutions, the number is staggering. More than 45,000 dead between the 1880s and the 1960s, the vast majority buried without names. But in 2023, something changed. A monument was unveiled at Napa, bearing the full names of over 8,000 people who died there between 1876 and 1964. The first memorial of its kind in the state. The names had been recovered by hand, one by one, from crumbling hospital ledgers. Some of the dead had never been identified at all. Researchers gave them back what little they could. It took over a century, but the people buried beneath that field finally have their names. Meanwhile, the castle itself was dying. The Gothic structure that had once been the pride of the valley had been deteriorating for decades. Strained by overcrowding, it was never designed to handle. It survived the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906 with barely a crack. But it could not survive the 20th century. In 1950, demolition crews arrived. The building refused to come down easily. They had to dynamite it. The castle, 10 million bricks, 7 towers, and 75 years of history, was reduced to rubble. A new receiving and treatment building rose on the exact same footprint, dedicated in 1954 as a symbol of modernization for mental health treatment. But modernization brought a transformation no one fully anticipated. In 1954, the FDA approved Thorazine, the first antipsychotic drug. It could do what lobotomies had attempted, calming psychotic and violent patients without destroying their brains. Across America, state hospitals began to empty. California led the way. New laws made it harder to commit people involuntarily. New funding was supposed to build community mental health centers to replace the hospitals. President Kennedy championed the idea, motivated in part by his own sister Rosemary, who had been permanently disabled by a lobotomy and institutionalized for life. The hospitals emptied. The community centers were never built. The patients ended up on the streets, in shelters, in jails. And when federal funding for community mental health was gutted in 1981, the last hope for a real alternative disappeared entirely. And Napa State Hospital quietly became something very different from what it had been. By 2010, more than 80% of patients were no longer civil commitments. They arrived through the criminal justice system. People found not guilty by reason of insanity. People ruled incompetent to stand trial. People too mentally ill and too dangerous to be paroled. The hospital had become, in all but name, a psychiatric prison. But it still had the old campus layout, gardens, courtyards, open walkways, trees to hide behind. It had never been redesigned for the population it now held. On October 23, 2010, a psychiatric technician named Donna Gross stepped outside during her dinner break. She had worked at Napa for 14 years. A patient named Jess Massey, who had a grounds pass allowing him to walk the campus unsupervised, attacked her between two buildings. He stuffed dirt into her mouth to stop her from screaming and strangled her to death. He took her jewelry, her gum, and less than $2 in cash. Donna Gross died outside. Massey's criminal history included aggravated sexual assault, armed robbery, and attempted murder. He had once slashed a woman's throat in a parking garage. He had been found not guilty by reason of insanity and transferred to Napa a decade earlier. Staff at the hospital carried personal alarms, but they only functioned inside the buildings. 350 employees staged a rally on hospital grounds. Their signs read, "Safety Now." The governor ordered flags flown at half staff. One psychiatrist who worked at the facility described the reality in blunt terms. Violence was not something that happened occasionally at Napa. It was part of the daily life, a constant. When a reporter asked a nurse why anyone would choose to work there, she answered with 2 words, "A Jesus job." 5 years after Donna Gross was murdered, the hospital reported more than 1,800 physical assaults in a single year. Staff pulled emergency alarms between 11 and 17 times every day. The federal government had tried to fix this before. In 1990, the Department of Justice imposed a consent decree on Napa, a legally binding agreement requiring the hospital to meet basic standards of care. It was lifted in 1995 after the state claimed compliance. Within a few years, everything fell apart again. When federal investigators returned in 2004, they uncovered a case that tells you everything you need to know about what was happening inside. A patient's family had called the nursing station directly. Their loved one was in crisis, they said, and they were afraid he would take his own life. The staff acknowledged the call. No one checked on the patient. He died that same day. That was not an isolated incident. The investigators documented stabbings, strangulations between patients with known violent histories, and patients locked in seclusion rooms overnight with no clinical reason. A second consent decree was imposed in 2006, covering Napa and 3 other California state hospitals. It was not lifted until 2013. Today, Napa State Hospital sits on its 138 acres along the Napa Valley Highway, surrounded by wine country. It holds approximately 1,255 patients and employs over 2,300 staff. It does not accept voluntary admissions. More than 90% of the people inside have criminal histories. The programs now include dialectical behavior therapy and sex offender treatment. Every year since 1949, the hospital fire department has driven through the surrounding neighborhoods on a truck they call Santa's Sleigh, handing out treats to children. The castle is gone. The moral treatment philosophy is gone. The patients who were buried beneath the eastern field have finally been given their names. But Napa State Hospital is still there, still operating, still struggling with violence, still sitting quietly behind its fences while the tourists drive past on their way to the next tasting room. It has been 150 years, and California still has not figured out what to do with this place. Napa State Hospital is just one of dozens of institutions like this across the country, each with its own buried history. If you want to see more of these stories brought to light, subscribe to the channel. There are places far worse than Napa that have never been talked about at all.